Welcome back, everyone. This is part 4 of our Chapter 14 lecture series for your textbook, Give Me Liberty, by Dr. Eric Foner. This section is entitled The Confederate Nation. Before we move on, I would like to draw your attention to the flag that you see there in the middle of your screen. This was actually the official flag of the Confederacy. This typical stars and bars that you see portrayed as the Confederate flag, that was actually the Confederate battle flag, and that actually wasn't even used up until near the end of the war itself. Interesting little side note. The focus question for this section was, how did the war effort and leadership problems affect the society and economy of the Confederacy? The president of the Confederacy was this gentleman you see right here, Mr. Jefferson Davis from Mississippi. And Jeff Davis was an interesting character, as a bit of a hothead, sort of an egotist, and his personality flaws really meant that he was unable to connect meaningfully with the public. And they also meant that he had some pretty contentious relationships with other Confederate leaders at the time. All in all, he was simply not as effective as Lincoln was in wartime leadership in general. The South also, very early on in its existence, outlawed political parties. Confederates believed that parties brought disunity. But what this also meant that the Confederacy never really had an effective tool of public political organization and participation that could really galvanize public support and morale around the war effort and the Confederate government. Government centralization was absolutely necessary for the war effort, but was considered hypocritical by many Southerners. One of the points of seceding from the Union was to escape what Southerners believed was the growing tyranny of an ever-increasingly strong federal government. And also, the Confederate avenue of diplomacy revolved around cotton and cotton exporting. Essentially, this was called King Cotton diplomacy. And this really, it failed, particularly with Britain. Remember, I discussed previously how the Confederacy early on in the war was actually in negotiations with Britain for Britain to come in on the side of the Confederacy in the Civil War, and the South hoped that the British need for continued southern cotton exports to keep their textile mills rolling would entice them to come in and support the Confederate government. However, Britain was able to bypass this somewhat by increasing cotton production in other territories it held, particularly India at this time. So as the war dragged on, Britain was actually less and less dependent on southern cotton. And of course, once Lincoln made the war specifically about slavery, Britain, who was still filled with with abolitionist sentiments at this time, didn't want anything to do with the South anymore at that point. Like in the North, social change and internal turmoil really divided the Confederacy. Public disaffection with the war grew as the war dragged on, particularly due to the fact that the vast majority of the war was fought on Southern soil, and Confederate civilians often witnessed this thing firsthand. The draft in the South also, like in the North, was a significant grievance. The old quote that I'm sure many of you have heard, that this was a rich man's war but a poor man's fight, certainly held true both North and South. The draft law in the South allowed wealthy slave owners to hire substitutes, and it also exempted one white male for every 20 slaves owned. So, like in the North, there were avenues for the wealthy to escape having to serve in the war. Whereas for the poorer Southerners, the South really needed every ounce of manpower it had. So few of your less well-to-do Southerners escaped having to serve in this conflict. The Confederacy faced an almost constant issue of shortages of essential commodities. The Union blockade and occupation made bringing in supplies into the Confederacy difficult at best. And really, it's kind of amazing the South held out for as long as it did, considering the issues it had in obtaining supplies. There was also, of course, massive wartime destruction. Again, most of the war was fought on Southern soil, and the Union policy known as hard war devastated the countryside. The Union particularly targeted and destroyed infrastructure, transportation networks, food supplies, the very things that made the prosecution of the war effort even possible itself. The Confederacy also printed about $1.5 billion in paper currency at this time, which by the end of the war had become essentially worthless. They also practiced other policies, such as impressment. No, not like the impressment of American sailors by Britain leading up to the War of 1812. This sort of impressment was the ability of Confederate soldiers to go onto anybody's property and essentially confiscate anything that it deemed or they deemed necessary for the war effort. Of course, something that many looked at as mere stealing. There was also tax in kind, and this took place especially towards the end of the war when that Confederate money had been made essentially worthless due to inflation. And the taxes the Confederate government asked was essentially about 20% of all foodstuffs produced, which, especially due to the other problems people had at this time with even growing food to start with in this war-torn countryside, was often more than most people could bear. There were food riots in many southern cities and massive debt on all sides. The military itself also experienced the desertion of more than 100,000 men, which substantially made the prosecution of the war effort even more difficult, especially as the war dragged on and the ability of the Confederacy to call up more soldiers proved more and more difficult. Much like in the North, in the South, the situation for women saw radical alterations at this time. There were unprecedented burdens placed on women, including managing businesses and slaves, because essentially all of the men, the vast majority of the men, were off fighting the war. They expanded into previously male-only spaces, including government girls, which was essentially clerical jobs, and spies on behalf of the Confederacy. Many engaged directly with government for the first time on behalf of their families, particularly through the act of petitioning. And they demanded government assistance, essentially government welfare, not as charity, but as essentially a right in itself. All struggled to cope with the burdens of the war, and the growing disaffection of white women surrounding the war effort threatened the waging of war itself. It decreased overall morale and increased male desertion from the army, as many women started to encourage their men to desert and come home to help take care of them and their families. Confederate leaders initially balked at the idea of using slaves as actual soldiers for the Confederacy, although it did on occasion happen, even early on in the war. As you can see from this picture here, this is a young Confederate soldier who brought his slave with him that fought by his side during his campaigns. And this happened not regularly, but quite often, actually. And of course, the Confederacy used black slaves for the more mundane tasks of the war effort, to dig the trenches and build the fortifications and things of that nature. However, towards the end of the war, as the Confederacy struggled to maintain its manpower resources, the Confederacy eventually did recognize and allow the arming of slaves. However, the war ended before any substantial recruitment of slaves took place. But again, many blacks worked as labor for the Confederacy. The war itself, especially after the Emancipation Proclamation and all of the runaway slaves that took advantage of this situation to break away from their situation, undermined slavery and the pro-slavery ideology itself. As one Southerner put it, if black people were good enough to be soldiers, then the entire edifice that we have built this institution of slavery upon, essentially the inhumanity of black people itself, was essentially a moot point. Alright, gang, that concludes part 4 of our chapter 14 lecture series. Don't go away yet, still one more part to go. Until then, study hard, and I'll see you soon.